Hello and welcome to Communication How. Today, we will be taking a look at the traditions of communication theory. Now, we have already had a look at the introduction to communication, what are the different elements, and what are the different forms and ways in which we communicate. At the same time, we have also seen the benefits of studying human communication. Today, we take a look at some of the traditions of communication theory. So, when you come to the word traditions of communication theory, you may at first wonder, what does this theory deal with? Well, we see that communication theory in a certain way refers to different ways by which these theories actually look at communication. Now, it is said that Robert Craig, he divides this communication theories into 7 traditions, and his approach to organizing theories is the most recent of the schemes that we have. Now, what are the 7 traditions into which he categorizes them? Let's have a look at them. The first is the semiotic tradition. Then you have the phenomenological tradition, then the cybernetic tradition, then the socio-psychological tradition, then the socio-cultural tradition. Sixth is the critical tradition, and the seventh is the rhetorical tradition. We shall have a look at all these traditions one by one. And when we take a look at these theories, it will then help us to understand how these different theories take a look or analyze communication from a different lens. And this, in other words, will help us to get a better understanding of how we interact with one another and how we perceive certain things in the world. So, what do these traditions do? Well, first and foremost, we see that these traditions, each of these traditions, can be thought of as offering a different perspective on communication. Now, some of these traditions also stand in opposition to one another, while others have a good deal of overlap. Now, as a group, these traditions also provide sufficient coherence to allow us to look at theories side by side and also to understand their essential commonalities and differences. Now, for Craig, these traditions provide a kind of an intellectual coherence, not by reaching universal consensus on one grand theory, but by promoting dialogue and debate across the diverse traditions of communication theory. So, in other words, when we take a look at these theories, they don't just show us the differences, but we also see the commonalities that are there between these theories. And in a way, we can thus have a dialogue and debate regarding these various traditions. And thus, we can thus enrich our knowledge about communication in general. Without much delay, let us come to the first tradition, that is the semiotic tradition. Now, semiotic, or the study of the signs, forms an important tradition of thought in the communication theory. Now, the basic unifying concept that unifies this tradition is the sign. A second basic concept is the symbol. And this symbol usually designates a complex sign with many meanings, including highly personal ones. Now, the semiotic tradition also includes a host of theories about the use of signs and symbols to represent objects, ideas, states, situation, feelings, and conditions outside of themselves. Now, semiotics is basically divided into 3 parts. Let's have a look at these 3 parts. First is semiotics, that is the study of signs and symbols as basic elements. Then we also have pragmatics, that is the study of the relationship among signs. That is, how do these signs interact with one another, or is there any kind of connection between one sign or another. And next we have the syntactics, that is the ways signs are combined into complex system of signs. And having a look at this threefold division also enables us to understand signs and symbols in a much better light. Now, coming to the semiotic tradition, we see that the system of relations among the signs is a foundation for communication theory. Now, for communication to occur, there must be shared understanding, not only of the individual words, but also of grammar, society, and culture, which means that when you take a look at individual words, you should also have an understanding of the culture of the society in which they have originated. And thus we see that when we take a look at words, the culture, the society also play a very important part in the induced meaning of certain words. Now, apart from that, we see that the semiotic tradition also has a considerable impact on communication theory. And this is because many communication theorists are interested in how signs and sign systems are used to accomplish things in the world. Now we see that these signs and sign systems are used as tools in today's world, and how these tools help us to communicate, how these tools help us to accomplish the tasks that we want to, is basically explained in this tradition. Now, there's a man known as Jean Baudrillard, and he points out that signs once stood for what they represented. For example, if you take a look at rank, duty, and obligation, told you how to behave as a member of the feudal class in the Middle Ages. Also, for example, if you had a high post or if you had a particular duty, you were expected to behave in that particular manner. Now, for example, if you are a police officer of a high rank, you have to behave in a particular manner. You cannot do whatever you want because there are certain things that are associated with that particular rank or with that particular duty. And as a result of it, signs at one point of time indicated what they were meant to. But now, however, we see signs are separated from what they stand for. And we tend to build our lives on symbolicity rather than anything real. We can take one clear example. For example, let's take a look at watches that we have. Now, the basic function of the watch is to tell the time. Now, earlier, that is why a watch would be worn. But now we have seen that watches do come with various models. Now, apart from the basic function of telling the time, we also have watches that can do many various things. First and foremost, we see that they come to be worn for their symbolic value, so, and also as a status symbol. So, for example, brands like Rolex, Edifice, Omega are basically ones which you would associate with rich people. And as a result of it, wearing those kind of branded watches also provide a kind of a status symbol that you have. And this also tends to be associated with the wristwatches. So apart from the primary function of telling the time, they also are used for other purposes. At the same time, we also see that people tend to privilege the Eiffel Tower in Las Vegas over the original one in Paris. And in this way, we see that once upon a time, signs stood for what they represented. It became easier to relate to the two. But now, since signs are separated from what they stand for, we tend to require some other kind of means in which we need to understand them. Now we can take a look also at words. Now, what are words? Words are signs, but of a special kind. They are symbols. And unlike the examples that we used above, that is of the watch and also of the Eiffel Tower in Las Vegas and the one in Paris, we see that most symbols have no natural connection with the things that they describe. There's nothing in the sound of the word kiss or anything visual in the letters hug that signifies an embrace. Now, for example, when we look at certain words, they do not tell us exactly what is the action. And here we see that when you say hug, the word hug does not signify an embrace. Now, same thing is, you can easily coin a term called a snarf or clag to signify or symbolize a closer kind of a romantic relationship. And even when it comes to non-verbal symbols like wings and waves, now the word wing does not basically indicate what it does. However, the meaning associated with it easily helps us to recognize that wing is something to do with the eye. Or similarly, wave is when you wave a hand. And in this way, we see that though they have the term is there, but it doesn't basically describe what it does. Now, there was this literary critic of the Cambridge University by the name of I. Richards, and he was the first one in the semiotic tradition to systematically describe how words work. Now, according to Richards, words are arbitrary symbols that have no inherent meaning. So he gives the example of chameleons. Now, we all know that chameleons take on the coloration of their environment. That is, if they are on a dark surface, their body color tends to darken a bit. If they're on a lighter surface, they tend to become a bit of a lighter color. And basically, the whole purpose of this is to blend in with the environment so that it becomes difficult for their predators in order to hunt them, something as a camouflage. Now, therefore, when we look at words, he says that words take on the meaning of the context in which they are used in. And in this way, we see that if a particular context is defined, we thus know the meaning of the words in which they are used. And as a result of it, that is why a certain word can have a different meaning in a certain context. And therefore, we see that context is very important when we are talking, and especially when we speak of the words having double meanings. Okay, some of the slangs which have double meanings. This becomes very important here because if you use the word normally, it would not have any other meaning. But the moment you put it in a different context, the moment you put it in a slang, in the context of a slang, the word takes a completely different meaning and means something completely different. And as a result of this, we see that therefore we need to look at the words in meaning of the context, need to look the word in the sense of the context. And therefore we see that he also rallied against the semantic trap, which he labeled as the proper meaning superstition. That is the mistaken belief that words take a precise definition. Now, for Richards and for other semiologists, meanings don't reside in the words or the symbols, but the meaning resides in the people and how the people use them. And therefore, this makes it a bit simple for us to understand that when we take a look at the meanings of certain words, okay, the meanings are not in the words. The words may mean something, but basic meaning depends on the people and how the people use it, because it is the people who use the words in different contexts. And as they use in different contexts, they tend to ascribe different meanings for these words. Now, together with his British colleague, C.K. Ogden, Richards also created a semantic triangle to show the indirect relationship between symbols and their supposed reference. So if you take a look at this triangle here, we will see that there are three basic elements which are there. First, you have the reference, which basically refers to the thought or connotation. You then have the sign, which basically is a representation. It could be a word, a sound, or an image. And then you have a referent, that is the object being represented. And if you closely look at this triangle, you will see that two of these lines over here are basically complete lines, whereas here you have a kind of a dotted line. And what that does is, why that is dotted and why the other lines are straight, we will take a look in the next diagram. So here we see that in this particular diagram, we see a link between the word dog and the actual hound. Okay, so basically here we see that we may have a kind of a general idea about a dog, but when we look at this object here, this hound, we also may have a different meaning. Now let's analyze this triangle very closely. Now, the top of the triangle shows us some of the thoughts that we may have while observing the hush puppy. Now, once you perceive the actual animal, so once you look at the actual animal here, there are certain thoughts that basically come to your mind. And these thoughts can be that the animal is warm, faithful, and he's very cuddly and a good companion as such. Now, since there is a direct or causal relationship between the referent and the reference, we see here that Richard connects these two with a straight line. So you can see that this line is straight over here because there's a direct link between the referent and the reference, that is between the thing and the thought that you have with the thing. Next, it is also said that your thoughts are also directly linked with the dog symbol that is there with the lower left of the triangle. So this becomes the general category. So here, when you look at a dog, you also have certain thoughts that are based on your childhood experiences or based on your past. Now, based on your previous experiences and on your childhood language learning, you usually know that the word dog is used to symbolize something that is very different. That is, a dog is somebody who is faithful, who guards the house, etc. And thus, because of this, we see that Richards diagrammed this relationship also between the thought and the symbol with a solid line. Now, we see that the connection between the word dog and the actual animal is tenacious at best. And as a result of it, Richards represented it with a dotted line because two people could use that identical word for completely different beast. For example, when you say dog, you might mean a slow moving, gentle pet who is very fond of children. And when I use the word, I can also mean it as a carnivorous canine who bites anyone and is also fond of children. And therefore, we see that unless we understand that ambiguity is an inevitable condition of language, most of us are liable to carry on a conversation about dogs without even realizing what we are talking about is two different breeds. So for example, when I look at the thing over here, the referent, the hush puppy, it could be a completely different animal, whereas the general term dog can be, though they are of the same breed, though they have the same family, but still here we see that they could be two different kind of behavior styles in these two aspects. And therefore we see that although Richards and Ferdinand de Saussure, the man who termed the term semiology, they were fascinated with language, but many researchers in the semiotic tradition also focus on the non-verbal emblems and pictorial symbols. So as we have it here, we can basically see that there is a direct relation between the thought and the thing, between the thought and the symbol. But when it comes to the symbol and the referent, the thing, we tend to see that there is a kind of a indirect relation, and this is basically symbolized here with the dotted line. So this is all for the semiotic tradition that we have dealt with. In the next episode, we will be dealing with the phenomenological tradition, and slowly we'll take a look at the other traditions. Thank you.